Hi, everyone. Meteorologist Steve Caparata back with another episode of Coast and Climate. You know, we're into the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season. I think you've all heard by now. It's been a relatively quiet one, but there was a new study came out about a month or so ago that I thought was really interesting. A trend that we've kind of noted in recent years, but now there's some hard data behind it that maybe the Atlantic hurricane season is trending towards an earlier start. So I wanted to bring in the lead author on that study. That's Dr. Ryan Truchelut. He's the president of a company called Weather Tiger, but also is the lead author on this article. It came out about a month ago. So Ryan, first off, thanks for being here this morning.
Oh, of course, Steve. It's great to be here.
All right, so before I get into your article, which I think was really well done, I wanted to ask you about, I mentioned you're president of a company called Weather Tiger. Can you tell us a little bit about what that company is, what you do there, and a little bit about your background? So, you know, as we do in 2022, is Googling you, because you and I haven't met personally. Your resume is quite impressive. So tell people about your background and how you got to where you are now with Weather Tiger.
Well, I'm one of those people that's had a lifelong love of weather. Growing up, a normal afternoon for me would be watching the Weather Channel, waiting for the tropical update with Dr. John Hope at 50 past the hour and playing with Legos. I grew up in Central Florida, so weather was a big part of my life. The daily thunderstorms, and of course, hurricane threats and hurricane season. So I wasn't a big fan of school. I liked that hurricanes got me out of school. So then I stayed in school for the next 20 years studying hurricanes, and that's the story of my life. I came to Florida State, got my master's and my doctorate in 2015. And when I graduated, I co-founded Weather Tiger with my co-founder and also wife, Dr. Erica Staling, who has a doctorate in atmospheric sciences from Princeton. We started this company because I had worked my way through college and grad school doing agricultural forecasting for um, people who trade corn and cotton, wheat and soybeans, and kind of the key agricultural commodities, working with farmers, working with traders, working with end users of those agricultural products. And I'd also, gone through the full academic gamut, and had gotten my doctorate from FSU. So, I felt like, we felt like between our various areas of expertise, there weren't a lot of other weather companies doing consulting that had both the academic background as well as the real world kind of experience of working one-on-one with clients and making this kind of esoteric data as useful and usable as possible.
Yeah, so your background's impressive and pretty neat to hear that you and your wife started your own company. Being on the morning shift like I am, my workday kind of wraps up sort of early. My wife works from home. I'm not sure she would have the patience for me to work with her all the time. So hats off to you guys on that. All right, so now we know a little bit about your background. This article was published, I think it came out in August in Nature Communications, but tell us a little bit about what spurred your interest to look into this issue of maybe the Atlantic hurricane season trending towards an earlier start.
Sure. Well, one of the things we do at Weather Tiger, I'm a hurricane forecaster. I write newspaper columns for the USA Today, kind of owned papers across the Southeast. That's syndicated column goes out every Wednesday or Thursday. And I also have my own Substack. So weathertiger.substack.com has all my forecasting stuff. And I've been forecasting for, running that kind of newsletter since the mid 2000s, really since the busy seasons of '04 and '05. So, I get my hands dirty forecasting, and, you notice certain things when you are forecasting US threats and trying to make that forecast information as easy to understand as possible. And, certainly something that has jumped out at the hurricane seasons between, 2015 and 2021 is every single one of them had a named storm develop before the official beginning of hurricane season on June 1st. And in 7 of those cases, the National Hurricane Center had to issue watches or warnings for the continental United States, again, before the start of hurricane season on June 1st. And communicating that information to the general public, it's kind of confusing to have people try to understand, why is this happening earlier? Why is this happening before I'm being told I need to be prepared before Hurricane Preparedness Week? before the start of the season. So it was something that just, it was a notable feature of the last 15, 20 years of hurricane seasons, but specifically in the late 20 teens, it was every single year. So, I work with a lot of other hurricane researchers and scientists, and we email back and forth when we see things that we don't quite understand or we want to know more about. And, this research project kind of developed organically just from those conversations. And so many other great co-authors on this paper, Phil Klotzbach, Kim Wood at Mississippi State, of course, my co-founder of Weather Tiger, Erica Staling, Dan Halpern, Carl Schreck, and of course, Eric Blake at the National Hurricane Center. So a great team that was, all interested in this question.
Yeah, a couple of those guys. We interviewed Dr. Klotzbach earlier in the summer about a seasonal hurricane forecast, which that's a whole other issue, right? That's been interesting this year. And Eric Blake and I go back a ways. We actually interned same TV station way back when we were undergrads in college. I've known Eric a long time. So let me ask you this. I thought this part was really interesting. Here along the northern Gulf Coast, most people are pretty hurricane aware, and they recognize that these early season storms maybe typically aren't our strongest storms or hurricanes. We see more of those here in Louisiana, especially August, September, sometimes in October. But I thought it was interesting, you noted these early season storms you found, while maybe they're not as intense as some of the ones when we get more of the majors late in the season, that these have more of a tendency to impact land and produce more rain. Is that right?
Correct. So the season starters, the first few, tropical storms or subtropical storms of the season, they typically form closer to the continental United States. Preferentially, they're forming in the Western Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, or kind of the southwestern Atlantic, east of Florida or east of the Carolinas. The control on why hurricane season starts when it does is because basically it's when do the waters of those regions get warm enough to support tropical cyclone or subtropical cyclone activity. And of course, when you're getting to the point where the waters are just getting warm enough to support a named storm, they're not warm enough to support a major hurricane. So we're not finding, there's a trend towards category 3s developing on Memorial Day. That's not really the threat that we're looking at. We're looking at tropical storms, generally on the weaker side of things, developing in the month of May. And we don't want to underestimate those events because there's the three major threats from a tropical cyclone are the wind, the surge, and precipitation. And of those three, excessive rainfall and freshwater flooding, flash flooding, is really the one that I think is underestimated. And that's unfortunate because we know that accounts for 30% of casualties from tropical cyclones. Unfortunately, flash flooding is a very deadly threat. And this trend is not simply theoretical or esoteric. It's something that we've seen in the past in the past decade. Tropical storm Alberto made landfall in late May of 2018, and unfortunately, it did $125 million worth of damage in the continental U.S. primarily from freshwater flooding. And there were a number of deaths in North Carolina and Virginia, well inland, associated with that heavy rainfall that fell up in the mountains. So it's something that the general public, I think, increasingly needs to understand is that excessive precipitation, it's not a secondary threat from tropical storms. It's a primary threat. It's every bit as deadly and damaging as wind and surge can be.
Yeah, and I think you, in the study, you even reference Tropical Storm Allison in 2001, which is one that hits home in our part of the world here in South Louisiana. It's a flood event that so many around here remember, and it was a freshwater flood event. Got the heavy rain, and there was river flooding that ensued afterward. It started in southeast Texas, but a lot of people forget Louisiana was kind of hard hit by that one too. All right, so let's get to the root cause of this. So you looked into that as well. So it looks like we're trending towards maybe an earlier start. And then you guys looked at a number of variables that might be responsible, but it seems like you kind of honed in on maybe one primary cause here, and that would be warmer sea surface temperature. So tell us a little bit about what you found and what variables you did look at as potentially leading to this earlier start.
Sure. So the focus of the study was twofold. The first thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure that these trends toward an earlier onset of tropical cyclone risks wasn't just due to chance alone. So we looked at not only when the first named storm developed, we looked at when the first few percentage points of total seasonal activity were occurring. We also looked at the initial US landfalls, which is something useful to do because you can go further back and have more trust that the data set is complete going back to around 1900. So we did all the appropriate statistical tests, and we found that those changes in onset were not due to chance alone. There's something physical causing that to happen. Very likely that there's something pushing this to occur. So then we set about to understand what it was about the environment that these systems were developing in that was changing, what was making the environment more favorable. So we looked at kind of an overall statistic called Genesis Potential Index, which helped us kind of understand that, yes, this environment was becoming more favorable overall in the Gulf, Caribbean, and Southwestern Atlantic in the spring, in May. And then we broke out the individual components of Genesis Potential Index and the things that actually are the ingredients that go into making a tropical cyclone, what in the environment needs to be present for something to develop. So we looked at, for instance, mid-level humidity. There has to be sufficient moisture, 2 or 3 miles up in the atmosphere so convection can build and grow and organize and turn into a tropical cyclone. Wind shear, the changing in strength and direction of winds with height going up in the atmosphere. You don't want too much wind shear because that will rip those developing thunderstorms apart and they won't be able to organize further. So we looked at all those kind of components of the tropical cyclone development environment. And what we found is that for the vast majority of them, there either wasn't a strong relationship between that factor and when the initial storms of the season were developing, or that there hadn't been much of a trend. There hadn't been much of a change since over the last 40 years in shear or moisture, for instance. They're pretty much the same as they were back in the 70s. The only thing that had changed in any kind of a significant way and was strongly tied, had a strong relationship to when the first storm of the year developed was sea surface temperatures in the Western Caribbean, Gulf, and Southwestern Atlantic. When those sea surface temperatures were warmer, that's when it was more likely for us to see the hurricane season start earlier. And there is a significant trend towards warmer temperatures in that box in May over the last 40, 50 years. In fact, those temperatures are about 1 degree Celsius warmer now than they were in the late 1970s. And for every degree warmer that box gets of the Gulf, Caribbean, and Southwestern Atlantic, our model shows that hurricane season is expected to start about 1 month earlier. It's not exact, it's just kind of an expectation. There's randomness around that because, individual disturbances have to find their way into a favorable environment. But the expectation is warm this box by a degree and you're going to get hurricane season starting on average around 30 days earlier.
That should be, I think, sort of an eye-catching tidbit to hear for people at home, because we know the oceans are warming, right? And if that trend continues, as we think it will, you're saying we could look at this hurricane season continuing to trend towards an earlier and earlier start, unless we're able to reverse this trend of warming oceans, right?
Correct. I certainly think that there's going to be continued warming, at least for the next few decades in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico in the spring. It's kind of an open question whether we hit some kind of other limiting factor in terms of environment, earlier in May. This study wasn't set up to determine, it wasn't a climate study. It wasn't something where we did modeling going out 40 or 50 years to try to determine if this trend would continue. This was a study that we did based on observations of hurricane history, as well as kind of the best guess of what the atmosphere looked like, over the last 50 years, what was causing those changes. So I don't want to oversell the findings, because we certainly, could hit something else that stops I don't think we're necessarily just going to see hurricane season starting in April or March. There's other factors that are certainly in play too. But on the flip side of that, I would certainly say that with a continued, very, very likely trend towards additional warming over the Caribbean and the Gulf expected, I would say that it's likely that we'll continue to see good chances of tropical cyclones developing in the proximity of the continental U.S. In May, going forward.
So another question for you kind of rises from this. A lot of times when you do a technical study like you guys have, you're able to kind of create a template and then expand that study and maybe look at some other questions. So naturally, what comes to mind for me is, have you thought about looking into this for other basins around the world, the Eastern Pacific, the Western North Pacific? Any thoughts of looking at those numbers and whether we're seeing earlier starts there also?
Well, there's a couple difficulties with doing that. For one, the Atlantic really has a superior historical record. We've just been keeping better tabs on tropical cyclone activity in the Atlantic for a longer period of time. So, observation bias of knowing that a storm was there, is always a factor. You have to know a storm was there for it to be in the historical record, and that is somewhat of a problem once you go out into the kind of lesser observed areas of the open ocean of the Pacific. As of yet, just very cursory look into it. We haven't really found that there is a trend in other basins. The Eastern Pacific already starts their hurricane season on May 15th. So historically, the Eastern Pacific does start earlier than the Atlantic. So I haven't dug deep on the other basins, mainly because of those data set issues. And also just because the Atlantic threats are close into the continental United States, so it's something that influences society and risk management decision making a little bit more than the other basins. But it certainly would be an interesting research question to look at the other basins in a more rigorous way, particularly as we have a longer time series of data going forward that we trust and is kind of more uniform.
All right, so given the results of your study, do you think we need to consider moving up? Well, we consider the official hurricane season right now runs from June 1st through November 30th for the Atlantic. We do know, as you know, the National Hurricane Center this year started issuing their tropical weather outlooks for the Atlantic earlier now, starting on May 15th. That used to be June 1st, coinciding with the start of hurricane season. So perhaps a little bit of a nod to this idea of an earlier start. The tropical weather outlook, for people that just aren't sure what I'm talking about, these are where we show the polygons on a map and say this area has a 20% chance of development the next 5 days, 50%, whatever it may be. So the Hurricane Center has already made that adjustment. But do you think we need to move up the official start date?
Well, it's a complex question, and it's a question that involves many stakeholders. It involves emergency management. It involves science communicators. It involves the forecasters at the Hurricane Center. And it of course involves the quantitative data and the objective understanding of how these trends are. Is the season trending earlier? Can we expect it to continue? And I hope that's what we've brought to the table with this peer-reviewed paper, is a little bit more of a fundamental firm basis to advise that decision making from the climatological perspective. We really tried to make this paper as useful as possible to those decision makers. It's a big question. I personally think that people do underestimate the risks of precipitation and the excessive rainfall threat from tropical cyclones. So if the season does move to a May 15th start date at some point down the line, there are conversations and there is kind of a panel that's looking into those different aspects of that decision. I think it would be a healthy thing that would emphasize the primary risk of excessive precipitation to life and property from tropical cyclones. So, it's something that I personally think probably would be merited, but it's also a conversation that needs to be had amongst many other stakeholders at the table, and I know those conversations are underway.
Yeah, an awareness tool in essence, I think, and I think that's a great point. All right, let's transition a little bit from your study because I know you follow the tropics closely. So everyone knows coming into this hurricane season, pretty much uniformly, the outlooks were for an above average season, some even calling for what we consider a hyperactive season. Obviously, thus far, the Atlantic's been pretty quiet. So any thoughts on what's going on, why it's been so relatively quiet? I shared a graphic on Twitter last Friday. From what I can tell, we've had no named storms in the Gulf of Mexico to date. From what I can tell, it's the first time we made it this deep in the season without a named storm in the Gulf since 1991. That's the year before Andrew, just to put in people's minds, the timeline there. So what do you think's going on this year?
Sure. So we are actually exactly at the halfway point in terms of accumulated cyclone energy today. Half of the season's ACE has historically occurred before this date, and there's another half to go. So we're sitting at the halfway point of the season, and we've had about 30 units of ACE, or accumulated cyclone energy. A more typical number would be around 50, or in more recent history, more like 60 or 65 units of ACE through the halfway point. Since 1950, if you stack up all the seasons since 1950 and where 2022 stacks up, we're less active than about 2 out of every 3 seasons right now, with Danielle and Earl in the past week kind of accounting for most of that. And that's a big surprise. At Weather Tiger, we issue seasonal forecasts along with many other research groups, including Phil Klotzbach at Colorado State, NOAA, and many others do as well. And as far as I can have seen, every single one of those research groups, including us, was calling for at least an above average season. And the basis of that forecast was, everybody does it a little bit differently, has a different methodology, but fundamentally, we are currently in the 3rd year of a La Nina event, and La Ninas tend to have lower shear over the Western Atlantic. They tend to be, and that's conducive for more hurricane activity, typically. And the water temperatures in the main development region of the Atlantic, from the Western Caribbean to the coast of West Africa, are generally somewhat warmer than average as well. And those are usually 2 primary factors that tilt the odds in favor of a more active and busier than normal season. So the fact that we've seen so little activity, and thankfully just nothing anywhere near the continental United States of any concern, is definitely a surprise. And it seems like the key factor that's caused this quiet first half of the season has been repeated dry air incursions into the central and eastern Atlantic, particularly the main development region, kind of south of 15 degrees north. We're seeing unusually dry air masses aloft that are getting pulled into the developing circulations around tropical waves coming off the coast of Africa. And that dry and dusty air mass is killing off the building blocks of tropical cyclones, those kind of bubbling convective cells that then organize and come west and can cause such massive threats to the US when they get a bit further west and they have time to organize. So those dry air incursions, it's surprising. It may have something to do with the fact that while the tropics are warm, the region just to the north of that and the subtropics are rather cool for this time of year. And then going further north into the mid-latitudes, the Atlantic is actually very warm. So kind of that warm, cold, warm sandwich. There's been some other years like 2013 where that seemed to drive drier air further south into the Atlantic in a way that wasn't expected and resulted in a quieter than normal season. Now, it remains to be seen if that will continue for the second half of the year. As you know, when you get into late September and October, you start to shift the region that we focus on for tropical development away from the Cape Verde region and the Eastern Atlantic back toward the continental United States, back into the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico as being the origin point of those later season storms. So, I wouldn't necessarily expect it to stay quieter than normal because we are in a moderate La Nina. The Gulf and the Caribbean are very warm. So, yes, it's been a surprise. I would also urge everyone to keep their guard up and not just assume that, it's going to continue to be a quiet year.
Yeah, it's a great point. And then the cliche of it only takes one, people get tired of hearing it, but it is very true. The example we always use in Louisiana was Andrew, of course. 92 was a quiet season overall, but a big impact from that one storm. All right, so before I let you go, we can see on the wall behind you, you've got a headline there. So you're based in Tallahassee. Obviously, Hurricane Michael, one of only 4 Category 5 hurricanes to make landfall in the United States. We know them on record, 2018. So I think you told me you were in Tallahassee, right, for that one. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Right, I was. So I was putting out my forecast products to my newsletter list as well as to the readers of the Tallahassee Democrat, which you can see over my shoulder here. That's the headline from October 10th, 2018, the day that Michael made landfall. So I was writing my newspaper columns, and I was doing a live blog the day of Michael from my house, which is in Tallahassee. Tallahassee did not get the worst of Michael. Panama City and the region about 50, 60 miles to Tallahassee's west got the worst of it. But in Tallahassee, we got probably sustained winds of around 50 to 60 miles an hour, wind gusts to 75, 80 miles an hour. And it certainly did quite a bit of damage in Tallahassee. We have beautiful tree cover here, all these old, ancient live oaks that are beautiful to look at, but not so resilient when it comes to storms. And we also have the tall longleaf pines, which are a little more wind resistant, but when the winds get high, their whole root ball comes up out of the ground and they can just slice your house in half if you're in the wrong place. So the day of Michael, I had pledged to my readers, I'm going to blog and live blog until I cannot, do so anymore, either because of, logistics, I'm out of power and internet, or, something has happened to my house. So I was also doing a number of TV spots I was getting these media requests from all over planet Earth, Australia and the UK, just coming in consistently during the day. And I was actually on, I was doing a live interview with the Australian equivalent of the Today Show when a branch landed on the power line that ran across my driveway, pulled the power line down onto my driveway and knocked out power. And you could kind of, what I heard back from the producers in Australia was that you kind of heard this thump, and then I kind of looked up and kind of looked shocked, and then I just, I froze. But apparently I caused a minor Twitter sensation in Australia of people, checking in that I was okay. I did finish the interview by phone later that day to just, assure the nation of Australia that I was alive and well. And it was, the damage to my house was very minor. Other houses in my neighborhood, not so lucky. A couple houses over from me, a 50, 60-year-old longleaf pine came down on my neighbor's house, and they had evacuated that morning. They unfortunately had not turned their water off when they left, so the pine hit their master bath, broke a water pipe, and the water was just shooting everywhere for 24 hours as soon as they could get back to the house, and unfortunately caused a lot of water damage in their property. And they were out of their house for 6 months, getting things repaired. Not only the exterior, but the interior damage was quite bad as well. There was no reason, I had sort of Damocles pines hanging over my house too. Could have ended a lot worse for me as well. So I feel quite lucky. But that was a very intense day, probably the most intense day of my life. We didn't know right up until the end whether Tallahassee was going to get the eye wall or not. Michael took a little jog to the northeast at around 10 a.m. that if that line had continued, would have put Tallahassee right in the path of the eye wall that Panama City and Mariana wound up getting. And the damage there was truly catastrophic.
I mean, the scenes were, unforgettable, seeing the damage. And even when you'd see some of the video a year later, of how much damage remained. Glad it worked out a little better for you at your home than maybe your neighbors. Yeah. And Michael, of course, one of those storms we've seen more of in recent years, intensifying through landfall. That was the other thing. All right, let's end quickly on a lighter note. Also, in doing a little research for our interview, correct me if I'm wrong, did I read that you were once a Jeopardy contestant?
I was, that's true.
Tell us about that experience if you could.
Well, that was another one of the most intense days of my life, maybe in a little bit, less meaningful, less at stake sense. It was great. I was on the show. It taped in 2013, aired in 2014. So it was Trebek era. I did not win. I went up against a defending champion who I beat and the other challenger beat, but the other challenger, he got me. I kind of got in the hole early. I went into the first commercial break negative, which was not a great feeling. Then Trebek asked me whether this was right after, it taped in 2012. So it was right after Sandy had hit. So I had a whole, I wanted to talk about how my wife and I are trying to climb the highest point in all 50 states. And Trebek was just like, no, I see you're a meteorologist. Was Hurricane Sandy caused by climate change? It's on the spot in a national audience trying to explain, climate change, to Alex Trebek. That was high pressure, but I was able to claw my way back into the game. I finally got a double, daily double right at the end. And I went almost true daily double to get myself back in the game. Got the true daily double, was still behind by a few $1,000s going into final. And then if the final Jeopardy question had been a tough one and the other challenger had gotten it wrong, I would have won, but it was pretty easy. We both got it right. So I finished with 20,000 and the other challenger finished with 30, something like that. So I got the proverbial box of your supply of rice-a-roni and, didn't get to come back for another episode. But it was a great life experience. It was a life goal of mine to be on the show. And, Trebek was a true professional. He has nothing but my respect and admiration.
That's pretty dang cool. Look, there's no shame in not winning. Making it there, that's a pretty big deal. Pretty awesome. Well, Dr. Ryan Truchelut, I can't thank you enough for being here. Really enlightened us on what you found with this trend towards an earlier start hurricane season, and also teaching us a little bit about Jeopardy. I'm glad I was not the one on the spot about Sandy and climate change. So hats off to you on that one.
Yeah. I was trying to explain the concept of variance to the studio audience. It was rough, but got through it.
Well, look, thanks again, and look, I hope things stay quiet for you over Tallahassee way for all of us the rest of this hurricane season. Fingers crossed.
Hey, me too. And Louisiana, let's just get through a hurricane season without Louisiana being punished. You guys have taken the blow for everybody in the last few years.
Oh, no doubt. It's been rough. We appreciate that. All right, Dr. Ryan Truchelut, thanks again. And if you want to go check out his study, it's a good read.
All right, take care. Thank you.
All right, folks, we're going to wrap up this week's episode of Coast and Climate. I thought that was pretty neat to learn about this trend towards an earlier onset of the Atlantic hurricane season. I say neat. It's good information, even if that's not something we want to hear. All right, so you can catch all the episodes live here on WAFB Plus every Thursday at 10 o'clock, and then they're posted on our website, WAFB.com, also our YouTube channel, so be sure to check them out there. Lining up a guest for next week, but I'll be back here next Thursday at 10 o'clock. We'll see you then.